Out of all the tanks in the world, the Merkava is a bit of an outlier. It's not often that a relatively small nation successfully designs and fields their own MBT. The Merkava is obviously unique for reasons beyond that. As far as I know, it is the only MBT to have an engine in the front. If your definition of MBT is a bit loose, I guess the TAM kinda counts, but whatever. The point is, it's a pretty unconventional design, and as it typically happens, that's led to people getting some odd ideas about it. Like many modern MBTs, the Merkava is surrounded by myths. Today, we're going to try dispelling a few of them. To make sure I'm not saying anything stupid, I talked to a few former Merkava crewmen, so hopefully this is fairly informative. The first myth is extremely common. It's often said that the Merkava cannon does act as a sort of IFV, being able to carry infantry in the back. Supposedly, thanks to the large door at the rear, they can exit fairly easily, so obviously it's a quasi-APC. This is sort of a half-truth, and the IDF is at least partially to blame for this one. When the Merkava was first shown off to the public, the IDF had a demonstration. They crammed a squad into it like it was a clown car, then had them dismount during the parade. Naturally, people were pretty impressed by this. However, it's not really an accurate representation of its utility. Merkavas can be used to carry personnel, but only on an emergency basis. Instead of carrying a squad, the Merkava may act as an ambulance. If you remove the ammo, you can fit around 4 stretchers and 1 medic, though this obviously isn't ideal. This is something they have procedures and training for, but I'm not sure how widespread the practice actually is. As for the door's primary purpose, it's for quickly loading ammo into the Merkava. The crew can also use it as an egress point, but this is more of a secondary feature. Another misconception is that the Merkava chassis is basically that of a Centurion, just with the engine at the front instead of the back. This myth isn't exactly new, but when the Merkava was first added to War Thunder, it became a lot more prolific. People were debating which tree it should go into, the British tree or the American tree. When the Merkava was being designed, the Centurion was used as a testbed, but that's pretty much as far as it goes. The Merkava chassis is entirely its own thing, and that was the point of making it in the first place. After Britain refused to give Israel chieftains, they decided to create a tank they could produce locally. They do have some similar features, namely the suspension and track tensioning system, but that's about it. Moving on, it's often said that since the engine is mounted in the front, that means the exhaust from the engine can block the thermal sight. The thinking is that the sight picks up thermal radiation, and the exhaust is very hot, so the exhaust must show up as a wall of white, or if the sight is set to black hot, a wall of black. There is essentially no evidence to back this up. I've never seen it mentioned in reports or documents. Exhaust does show up on thermal sights, but it dissipates very quickly. There are plenty of mass-produced vehicles that have this arrangement. Bradleys, Strykers, Merkavas. I've talked to former crews for every single one. All of them say it isn't an issue. In fact, one former Merkava crewman told me that since the Merkava 2B didn't have thermals for the commander or driver, they would have the gunner use his thermal sight to guide the driver, which means that much of the time, he would be looking directly at the exhaust while the vehicle is moving. Regardless, if it was an issue, you would think it'd be referenced somewhere. The Army makes plenty of reports scrutinizing tiny flaws in its vehicles. You would think that if a vehicle had a blind spot over its front, that would be worth noting. The final myth isn't really common, I just thought it was funny, so I wanted to talk about it. Some people seem to think that the Merkava was designed to fight in cities, mostly because the Mark IV is an APS, a really strong turret, and instead of an L55 cannon, they use a shorter L44. For that last bit, the thinking is they want a shorter barrel, you know, for CQC. The reason the IDF doesn't use L55s is because they build their own cannons. It's not just a license-produced M256. If they wanted to buy L55s, it would obviously be much more expensive than making their own guns. And if they produced it under license, it would require a ton of retooling, all for very little benefit. As mentioned before, the Merkava was made so they could be self-sufficient. They didn't want to rely on other nations. Not to mention that at that time, they weren't doing a lot of counterinsurgency in cities. Anyway, that's pretty much all there is to say. If you guys have tank myths you want me to cover, leave them in a comment. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.